What makes a story so compelling that audiences see themselves in it? In this episode of The Lead Creative, I talk to Angus Gibson, the multi-award-winning producer, director, and filmmaker whose work includes Yizo Yizo, Zone 14, Isibaya, the enthralling Shaka Ilembe, and many others. Angus shares how he taps into human insight and listens deeply to stories that shape our culture, which he then reflects on screen.
We assume our ignorance. We assume that we have to learn about the world that we are describing.
He also shares how he breaks the mold of traditional storytelling, creating unforgettable moments of tension and authenticity.
It was a very unnerving scene, and it happened right at the top of the series. And so I think the message that conveys is this is where the filmmakers are prepared to take you. So you better watch out, kind of thing. So you have to. So then the audience is thinking, oh my God, what is around the next corner?
Stay tuned to uncover how Angus Gibson crafts stories that move us, stories that entertain us, and stories that sometimes change how we view the world around us. This is The Lead Creative. I'm your host. My name is Mongezi Mtati. Please remember to share and subscribe. Welcome to the Lead Creative Podcast, where we talk to creative industry leaders, influencers, and brands. We discuss the strategies that influence brand thinking and shape industries. Thought leaders and heads of agencies let us in on some of their thinking and insights. I'm your host, Mongezi Mtati. Enjoy the show, and please share and subscribe. Angus, thanks so much for making the time to join us on The Lead Creative. What an honor to have you in this conversation, fresh out of the Season 2 shoot of Shaka Ilembe.
Thank you. Well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm sort of fresh out of the edit suite right this moment. Yeah.
Amazing. Do you remember the first story that captured your mind and contributed to how you tell the stories of humanity today?
God, that's a big question. You're talking about when I was a kid?
At whatever point, I suppose the one that you remember and you thought, this could be something I could go into as a career.
I was a big reader.
Yeah.
I really disliked my school, and I didn't feel like I sort of got a great education from my school. So reading was like where I got my education.
Yeah.
And I was sort of quite a precocious reader. I remember reading D.H. Lawrence and Joseph Conrad and that sort of thing when I was about 12. But I do remember much earlier, maybe when I was 7, there was a very thick volume of the Grimm's fairy tales, which are all grim. They're all sort of pretty dastardly tales.
Yeah.
Witches and darkness and dastardly things.
Yeah.
And I consumed that book. And it was thick. It was a substantial volume.
Yeah.
So that stays with me. I have, sort of flashes that stick with me. So, for example, when I was about 12, I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's film, and I remember, I actually have a memory of me standing, for some reason, not in the seat, but standing in the aisle and looking at the screen and thinking, what the hell is this? Because it didn't conform to any of sort of my expectations of narrative. And I suppose the clue there is its non-conformity kind of really captured me.
Yeah.
And it remained, all the images from that movie that I'd seen at 12 remained absolutely, and remain still, etched in my mind. And I think that non-conformity is a thing. And in fact, curiously, when I was 17, I went off to the movies. I was staying in Parktown, and I walked into the central city where there was a screening of 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
And it was full. And there was a film next door, and I didn't know what it was. It was called The Passenger. And it was a film by an Italian director called Michelangelo Antonioni. And it was kind of the perfect film for a 17-year-old to see. It was sort of suitably pretentious, but it was a very enigmatic film. It was Jack Nicholson sort of in an existential crisis. And I watched that film, and I came out of it, and it was clear for me. I was studying economics at Wits, but when I came out of the film, it was 100% clear for me that that was what I was going to do. I was going to make movies. And that film was it was quite a bummer. I mean, it's sort of, in the end, our lead character is left, so you see him dead on the bed kind of thing. And the girlfriend that he has sort of found in Spain somewhere is sort of wandering in the piazza.
Yeah.
So, it's no bright, happy ending. And if I think of the same thing, if for many years, if people said to me, "Oh, what's your favorite film?" I said the film Chinatown, which, Robert McKee uses as sort of the perfect script. But the thing that defines Chinatown as well is quite a bleak view of the world. In the end, the person that wins the day is the villain. And it's a sense that wealth and the system out there ultimately will bat down the good man, kind of thing. So that, and interestingly, it was an end that Polanski had put on the film. Robert Town had written not such a bleak end, but Polanski put the bleak end on the film, and it's no doubt that it was Polanski's project that I particularly connected to, not the Robert Town version.
And you've
in
since
fact,
gone on
curiously,
to...
I saw a version of Tsotsi, the pirated version of Tsotsi before it was released.
Yeah.
And it was the sequence in which he is shot dead, as opposed to him surviving. And also, for me, a sort of more satisfying end than the happy ending. So I don't know why I'm telling you all this, but
no, I think it gives me great insight into how you view stories and how you receive them.
And, if I think of coming back to South Africa, I did the Mandela biographical documentary, and I did the post-production in New York, and it took a long time, and I came back to South Africa sort of, in that moment of the sort of Rainbow Nation and those kind of adverts with people slapping each other, black people, white people together, slapping each other on the back. and I kind of had such a strong sense that this was a fiction. So Tebogo and I got together, and the first thing we did was write a film which kind of kicked that fiction in the pants kind of thing. And it was a film called Street Bash. And I remember people reading the script and saying, you know, nowadays foreign language films have to be
more hopeful
upbeat.
than that.
They have to be, you know, they have to. And it was the era of a film like sort of Cinema Paradiso or like Water for Chocolate or something. And A City of God hadn't happened at that point, nor had Amores Perros or those, you know, considerably bleaker films. And so it never got made, but its spirit kind of transferred itself into Yizo Yizo in a way.
Yeah. Do you know when going into a story, a film, that this is going to be an iconic piece of work?
Well, I always want that.
Yeah, sure.
And sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't. I suppose a defining factor for me, you know, goes back to the nonconformist thing, is I don't want to repeat what either I have done or what other people are doing. So my impetus is to do something different.
Sure.
And if you go back to Yizo Yizo, the real impetus there was, it felt like on television there was no real representation of how people lived in the world in South Africa, or certainly how black people lived in the world in South Africa, in the context of an urban space. So, you know, the way language, the particular way in which language is sort of mashed up in an incredible way with, you know, because people have such extraordinary, extensive knowledge of language. It was never represented on screen, and it felt like, you know, that was immediately something that we want to do. And I remember, in fact, at the time, Tebogo, when we were doing Street Bash, which is the film that never got made, Tebogo's original impetus was, let's do like a B movie, like a really sort of a movie in bad taste. And he had a real sort of gut feeling that would connect to the South African audience. You know, we sort of honed and crafted it, and I don't know if it ended up as a film in bad taste, but and it never got made, but its spirit went into Yizo. So there, you know, it was about a lens on the world that hadn't been seen before. I mean, with Zone 14, what I was seeing was only aspirational kind of, you know, Generations, when it first started, was kind of, it was in English, and it was about an aspirational world as opposed to a reflection of most people's reality, I suppose. And I was very keen to do something that was much more grassroots. And so Zone 14 was a kind of an attempt to do that and to find a home for the many actors that we had found on Yizo Yizo that were just not fitting into, you know, I don't know, whatever was being made at the time. So Zone 14 felt fresh. For me at the time. And if I take a big leap to Isibaya, that in a way was a response, because post Yizo Yizo, everybody had been doing this urban gritty thing. And it felt like that the
narrative had shifted,
narrative was entirely neglected. And I'd spent quite a lot of time down in the Tugela Valley, and I I had two friends who had polygamous households.
I want to come
So I
back to
wanted,
that. I want to come
yeah,
back to that, Angus, because that is one of the things that I want to kind of hone in on. I just want to
yeah,
stick with Yizo Yizo for a little bit,
okay,
because when Yizo Yizo took over our screens, I was the township, this kid in a township
yeah,
going to schools that looked like a lot of what we were seeing, and it divided us as kids and parents, as learners and teachers at the time.
yeah,
But in very many ways, it captured our experience, right? It captured the experience of, this is a kid I know from my school, from a different school, and all of that. To what do you attribute your ability to capture the essence of people's stories as someone on the outside looking in ways that people see themselves in these stories?
So I come from a tradition of documentary making, right? As did Tebogo. So both of us came out of a documentary space. And I suppose fundamentally, I think one of my attributes is that I'm a listener more than I'm a speaker.
Yeah.
And one of our key, the position we take on pretty much every project is we assume our ignorance. We assume that we have to learn about the world that we are describing. And I mean, when we did Yizo Yizo, I mean, I spent years making a series of documentaries on the history of Soweto, and I'd spent a lot of time talking to people in Soweto. I mean, literally over a period of 4 years or something. And I mean, no doubt that informed it. But more importantly, I think, is the notion of listening and learning. And also, I mean, I don't work as an island. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm very much a collaborator, and the team that I am part of is very important. And I would extend that in the sense that, you know, particularly on Yizo, I don't know, we found a whole batch of actors that kind of had never been given the opportunity to do the kind of things that we were wanting them to do on that show.
Yeah.
And so they were huge contributors in the process. And I think, you know, we were very open to improvisation.
Yeah.
So there was an enormous amount of improvisation happening on the set. And so, you know, there was a script, which was, you know, was strong, but what happened with the actors on set and in the creation of each scene, I think brought an enormous amount of specificity that might otherwise not have been there.
Yeah.
And look, and I mean, at the time, Tebogo was, you know, his memory of school was not, you know, he was young, he was very young.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was not all that far back. Does that begin to answer your question?
If you're enjoying The Lead Creative, please share this episode with your network and hit follow or subscribe. Enjoy the show. Yeah, it does. It does. You also talk a lot about collaboration in your work, from the deep research while working on Yizo Yizo. You've just mentioned, you mentioned that you've been talking to people for about 4 years, and the friendship you formed with Sipho Mchunu while working on Isibaya, for instance.
Yeah.
What do these collaborations add to the final work that we end up seeing as audiences on screens?
Well, I suppose, I'm interested in the real world, and I'm interested in real people, and I'm interested in the way that real conversations happen, as opposed to scripted conversations. I mean,
Yeah.
and I suppose when you asked me at the beginning of the interview, what is the story that
Captured your imagination.
that
Yeah.
captured me right in the beginning? I suppose it's not. It's not really stories that. It is the real world
Yeah.
that I'm interested in, and I'm interested in reflecting that.
Yeah.
And I suppose, it comes from a curiosity about the real world and being an observer, probably more than an actor in the
Yeah.
real world, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Yeah. Just that listening part that you were talking about
Yeah,
earlier. Yeah.
yeah. And at school, in fact, people reminded me that, when I was at primary school, I was the funny guy, in the sense that I could make people laugh. And I suppose, the desire to entertain is definitely there. And so that's always been there.
Yeah.
And I'm still thinking about what that first first story was so I can answer your question properly. But certainly the Grimm's fairy tales stands out.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you share a moment
Oh, I
when
can tell you.
you?
I can tell you
Sure.
when I was
Yeah.
extremely young.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a book I had called Bunnykins or something. Literally, it was like my mother read it to me. But it was like these bunnies that go on this picnic.
Yeah.
And the truth is, the reason that I liked the story was because there was this dark moment in which they heard these strange, terrible sounds. And they went and they looked over this fence in expectation of, what was the terrible thing that they were seeing.
Yeah.
And it was a pig that was making these sounds. But the point was the dread of what might be over that fence was what interested me in the narrative and took me back again and again, of an evening. that was the story that I wanted, and it was the dread that interested me.
Yeah.
So, if I was to, my other talent, I suspect, is for tension or dread or, for example, on Yizo, I think that people think of it as dark and violent. Mm-hmm. But in the context of, contemporary television or, even television contemporary to that time where there's a huge body count. In fact, on Yizo, there were very little, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was, and what we did, I think, was in the very first episode, we set up dread in that the scene in which Ronnie, Papa Action, sticks Bobo's head in the toilet and sort of does these satanic chants. I think it's sort of, it was a very unnerving scene. And it happened right at the top of the series. And so I think the message that conveys is this is where the filmmakers are prepared to take you.
Yeah.
So you better watch out. Kind of
Yeah.
thing. So,
Yeah.
you have to, so then the audience is thinking, oh my God, what is around the next corner? If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've spoken about You're talking about while doing the research for Yizo Yizo, about the story of a kid who brought a grenade in a lunchbox or something like that.
Yeah.
Can you think of a moment when your research while creating a piece of work changed your perspective or the direction that you thought you were going to go in while going into that piece of work?
You know, I sort of have a thing in mind, which was, which I don't think entirely answers your question, but I mean, it's an interesting circumstance, was I was asked to make a film on, by British television on the black middle class.
Yeah.
This is in the end of the 80s. And I said to them, I don't know what a black middle class is.
Yeah.
You know, there are many different experiences of, I mean, I suppose they were talking about being relatively, you know, having relatively large amounts of money or whatever. And, you know, there are many different experiences of that. And I said, I'm prepared to do a portrait of a few people, but I'm certainly don't see I can't imagine giving a definitive answer on what it was. And so I ended up doing a portrait of a golf club that happened to be in Orlando East, in an original Orlando East house.
Yeah.
Which this bunch of guys had taken over and was, and they described it as their golf club. They were all golfers, but of course none of them were able to join any golf club.
Yeah.
Other than the pretty ratty one that was in Soweto. So they all kind of either worked for IBM or F&B or whatever, and their bosses would somehow work out access for them to the golf clubs that they were members of.
Yeah.
So anyway, I decided on my rosy, you know, I sort of looked at them and I thought, well, who am I going to do this portrait of? And there was this guy who was sort of very wholesome, and his wife was an ex-Miss Africa South, and he had family, in fact, that he was sending abroad to study. So I thought, well, here's an interesting portrait. And as I sort of engaged with him and the family, I sort of realized there was, you know, he sort of started out incredibly keen to be part of the project. And then I suddenly realized the more I asked questions, the more reluctant
he becomes.
He was. And he eventually was basically saying, I don't want to be any part of this. And Peter Wundler, if you know who Peter Wundler is.
I do, yeah, I do. Yeah.
Was also a member of the golf club. And I had he had been a sort of side character for me in the thing, and I thought, okay, let me just shift my lens to Peter. And Peter said, but don't you realize the character that you're following has an extraordinarily dark past? And so, of course, you know, you can't ask any questions. And so I had to entirely shift the focus of and I'm not going to get into the person's dark past.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it'd be inappropriate. But I just entirely switched my lens to Peter Wundler, who in that moment was just beginning to think about herd boys. You know, he was, I remember he had a black Jetta, and he lived in Deep Kloof Extension, and on a Sunday he would shine his black Jetta, and, you know, it was like the beginnings. And he sort of drove me around, you know, Inanda and that part of Joburg, and said, you see that house? That's the house I want. And you see that satellite dish? I want a satellite dish. And it was incredibly prophetic, because it was not long before he
started Head Boys,
He had all those things. So, I mean, there was a case in which reality sort of pushed me in another direction. But where research has kind of shifted me,
Yeah, I think
if I
that
think
is. I
of
mean,
it,
that
I'll
is
come back to
definitely a good. That's definitely like a great example of that. I think because like you said, you started out not sure what character to build on, and then you found the character, and but then it shifted where you had started out. I mean, when we started the conversation, I mentioned Shaka Ilembe a
it.
bit,
Yeah.
and that is one of, in my mind, the most iconic things to watch on TV right now. And to be honest, I was skeptical before I watched it. And I was skeptical because we'd heard the story of King Shaka, the Zulu kingdom, quite a number of times. So then I watched it, and then I watched it, and then I watched it. And I'm going to watch it again before season 2 comes. Why are some stories that have been widely told still so captivating? I mean, there's a clue in what you said earlier that you don't want to do what's been done or what you've done before, and there are many, I guess, questions that come up for me as somebody who was, skeptical to watch it, and then realizing that there are so many facts, so many things that had never been told or never been shown about the story. Why are some stories still so captivating today when they are told through a different lens?
Well, I mean, look, let's face it. Shaka himself is, you know, is an extraordinary character.
Yeah.
I mean, you think of South Africa and you think of who are the extraordinary characters. He's certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Like Winnie Mandela is another. Both people with light and dark. They're complex, intelligent. They are the sort of characters, that one is drawn to speaking about. But that said, I certainly did not want to do a project on King Shaka because there was so much written about him, and and there'd been the 80s series,
Yeah.
and people seem to love the 80s series. So I thought, oh my God, how do we replace Henry Vele, and but. I was, the Frontier Wars felt like completely untold. There were all sorts of narratives that have not been told.
Yeah.
And I was sort of more pushed, early Joburg, Non-Goloza and all of that, and
Yeah.
the Mabata Rebellion, all of that has not been told. But anyway, we were asked to pitch specifically on King Shaka, and we did, and we got it. And then, so back to the beginning, we think, well, okay, we will do research. And we did years of research on the
Yeah.
project. We read everything we possibly could. And our immediate first impulse was, the 80s series, what was particularly irritating about it was that it was, it started in Europe, and its lens was from Europe of an exotic African king. And, we wanted to turn that around and let it start here.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's only in the third season really that white people who are the exotics in the series really appear. So there was that impulse, but as soon as we were doing research, it was clear the characters around Shaka were, so interesting and captivating, and nothing had been done on them. They hardly had been represented. And so, in a way, Shaka is not the main character of the first season.
Yeah.
The main characters are Nandi and Dingiswayo. Gorongwana Dingiswayo is sort of
Yeah.
is the adult arc that takes you through the season, and it allows you then to let Shaka grow up.
Yes.
And it's a bit like the way that Jon Snow is is not foregrounded in the beginning of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
It's sort of, there are other characters that are foregrounded. And so immediately what was attractive to us was we were able to tell stories that hadn't been told before. And especially back pre-1810, there are big holes in what is known. You know, even if you are exploring the sort of spoken word and praises, there's still holes. So it sort of gave us opportunity to write fiction in a way, in elements of the narrative, quite safely. So, for example, you know, we didn't know what happened to Dingiswayo in his exile. We knew he had been exiled for many years, but we didn't know what had happened. We knew that he had been at the Hlubi at some stage. We knew that he had formed a relationship with Makasana, the king in the Mozambique area. But in fact, most narratives sort of speak of him going to the Cape, and you know there was narratives of he brought his battle strategies back from the Cape, and there was a lobby in our writing room which was saying, we do not want this. We do not want the idea that, you know, the short stabbing spear is in fact, you know, borrowed from the European bayonet. You know, we want it as an original thought. And we wanted to touch on the slave trade that was happening out of Mozambique. And so we created the narrative of the flight down to Mozambique in search of Balega, and that way of cementing the relationship between Ngomani and Dingiswayo. So that was, I mean, that's all created. But it's created in a hole in the history, if you know what I mean. You know, you can dispute it, but it might well have happened. And he certainly had been in the area because, you know, he had the relationship with Makasana.
This episode is sponsored by the digitally led customer experience agency Roger Wilco. For all your customer experience, digital marketing, and web development needs, go to rogerwilco.co.za or rogerwilco.co.uk. You can also download the South African CX Report and the Township CX Report directly from their website, free of charge. Don't we all love something free every now and again, especially with insights, right? Now back to the show. My understanding is that you shoot Shaka Ilembe in winter because of the kind of light that you get out of that period. Can you describe your creative process? How would you describe your creative process? I mean, from what you've told me, I understand that it's collaborative. I understand that research forms a huge part of it. But to you, what goes into what you believe, what you feel is your creative process when you create work?
So the aesthetic is very important to me. And I mean, Toboko and I had that in common. You know, I think we both, aesthetic was very important, the way a thing looked, the way a thing was constructed. And I suppose, you know, with each project, we try and think, well, how can we give this particular project a particular personality? And in fact, if you go back to the first Yizo, there are 3 chapters in terms of the aesthetic of that first season. And each is completely different. So in the first season, when the authoritarian principal is in control, everything is shot in very sort of formal, extreme wides and close-ups, all at eye level. And there's a formality to the shooting.
Yeah.
And when he leaves and the school falls apart, and first of all, we colored the entire school red. And we literally painted the school red, which for us was a sort of a color that was both about blood and about fascism. And then when the school falls apart, we drained the color right out of the series. If you recall, the middle section has almost no color in it whatsoever. And we took the camera off the tripod. There's not a single shot in the middle section which is shot on a tripod.
Right.
And it's an entirely different style of shooting. And it sort of emphasized the chaos of what that period in the school was. And then the last chapter is where the chaos starts to write itself and other color creeps back into the series, and it finds a sort of middle ground in terms of the way it is lensed. And so, and a thing we said then is we wanted, if you turned the television on, we wanted you to know what you were watching.
Yes.
That it wasn't like, oh, this could be, this could be Generations, or it could be, oh, that's Yizo, whatever it is. And that's kind of informed. And I mean, if I make a leap all the way to Shaka Ilembe,
yes.
So we would often look for a single image as a guiding tool. So, for example, Yizo 2, there was a single image that was taken inside a church of some furniture and a wall that was sort of painted with a gloss turquoise enamel. That sort of classic turquoise that you find all over the Eastern Cape, and for our aesthetic, that image was the starting point.
Right.
And so we went from the red of the first season to the blue, cold light of the second season, and everything conformed to that. And the criticism of the second season was that it was so dark, that the black skins were so dark in it.
Yeah.
And so our response to it in the third season was to sort of celebrate the color of brown skin, and so the second season is all kind of golden and brown and chocolate and
I get a lot of that feeling when I watch Shaka Ilembe. That's kind of the feeling that I get.
So if I go
deliberate.
So the Shaka Ilembe, my wife is a curator was a curator at Wits Art Museum, which has the largest African art collection. I don't know, I stand to be corrected, but possibly in Africa, and one of the most substantial in the world. And anyway, if you look at the early 19th century Zulu objects, they are of this extraordinarily simple and perfect form. So very different to the aesthetic that people associate with Zuluness in the 20th century, which is quite irreverent and quite funky almost. The incredible use of plastic, the incredible use of beadwork, all of that kind of, And for example, the guitar of the 20th century, none of that was present in the 18th century where we start. But what was evident were these incredibly perfect forms.
Yeah.
So if you think, for example, of the perfect form of the beehive hut, it's like it is a perfect thing.
Yes.
And our general feeling was, in terms of a representation of Africa, it is sort of, it's again and again a representation of people in plight, in poverty, sort of.
Yeah.
And there's a whole noble history, and present for that matter, that is underrepresented in our view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So it was clear that we wanted to represent the perfect form. And so, of course, that extended into... And so, in fact, if you look at the show, it's very conservative, actually, in its choice of lensing and in the way in which scenes are covered.
Yes.
Because we wanted a classic form. We wanted it to be unashamedly beautiful. And so light, of course, is a huge thing with that. And there's no doubt that backlight is much more enigmatic and elegant than frontlight.
Yeah.
And so a ground rule with Shaka Ilembe was that everything would be shot backlit, everything. So there's almost nothing, we cheat.
Yeah.
When there's a person that's sort of with the back to the sun and with the front to the sun, we cheat so that both people have their backs to the sun. At best, side light, but never front light, which presents challenges all the time. But you end with a very particular aesthetic that is there in the series.
Yeah. Just to switch things slightly, there's obviously this rise of digital in every space, right? Like we're seeing bits of it everywhere. Do you think digital platforms like YouTube, for instance, social media, and all the others are reshaping how stories are told, especially in the South African context?
Yeah, I'm not a good person to ask this because I don't watch, social media on the whole, I don't do much of.
Yes.
I've recently, I have to admit, been seduced a bit because I was, on Instagram. Mm-hmm. But I've kind of literally almost never looked at Twitter.
Right.
I've never looked at Facebook. TikTok, all of that is foreign territory to me because I'm nervous of the collective experience. I suppose no. I mean, the collective experience in a cinema I like, but that said, I think the digital world is transforming things, and there's no doubt that the way that we have viewed things is on its way
Shifted.
out.
Yeah.
And that what you describe is the future. People watching things on their phones is what's happening. And YouTube, appointment television feels like it has a short history ahead. I mean, I can't see it lasting much longer. And how does that affect? I mean, look, there's no doubt that the short attention span is a big factor. And
And that's also interesting because that we talk about a short attention span, but actually series episodes are getting longer and longer rather than shorter because of on-demand content consumption, I suppose. Yeah.
That's true. And I think there are no simple answers.
Yeah.
And I think, what you can do now on an iPhone is extraordinary. I mean, I've just, recently I happened upon this very young guy, and I happened to see some of his work, and I looked him up and I said, "Show me more." And he showed me like films he had made and a whole range of things
Yeah.
that are extraordinary. Everything, pretty much everything, shot on his iPhone.
Yeah.
And he's very young. He has a sophistication that is extraordinary. And I think that so the consumption of things that is happening with social media is educating people very young. Educating people aesthetically and in all sorts of ways. So it has its extreme negatives and it has its extreme positives. And so I'm happy to watch something that is made that is rough in its construction if its soul is interesting,
Yes.
or original, so I'm again not really answering your question, but I'm suspicious of the new world, and I admire it as well from a distance.
Yeah. So Angus, you've told iconic stories that have shaped culture, that have reshaped how we look at ourselves in many ways as South Africans, as communities, on big and small screens. What can advertising learn from your approach to storytelling to make short form content, especially brand content, less intrusive and more engaging and more welcome by the consumer?
So when you asked if you could do an interview with me, and I thought, like, what do I know about advertising? There was BOM has had an advertising section for many years, and we don't at the moment. We did for many years, sort of with Tobacco at the heart of it, and I had virtually nothing to do with it. But nevertheless, so in fact, I was invited to go to the Luries to receive an award together with Palesa, Tobacco's wife, on behalf, a posthumous award for Tobacco. And I mean, and when he died, we put together, a show reel of his work that we loved. And I absolutely do feel like it was his engagement and specificity and sort of understanding of the little nuance that made you think, I recognize that grandmother. I recognize this moment of greeting. I recognize the way that picture is hung on the wall. I kind of feel like, and again, it was his curiosity and interest in everything around him that informed the great work that he did, I think.
Sure.
And then, look, I sort of don't watch television, so I kind of don't get to see ads. So
Yeah,
when I
yeah.
was at the Luries, I was sort of seeing all these ads for the first time, and I was thinking, oh my God, there's such great work out there. And last year, almost most things that won were chicken adverts, and quite specifically chicken licken adverts.
Yeah.
Or most of which I think Greg Gray had made.
Yeah.
And, I mean, and now, in fact, on Instagram or something, there's a chicken licken ad, the person that has to make a decision one way or another.
Yes.
And I felt like the engagement with performance, the observation of character, and the classic storytelling that's happening in all those ads is so beautiful and so sophisticated. I mean, I could watch those ads again and again and again and again. And it's about, I suppose, I am drawn to people.
Yes.
So it is ads with great performance that I want to watch again and again. And, with Tawoko, the ad he did, with Ace, the kids that get together to play soccer.
Yes.
The Cecil ad, do you remember?
Oh, yes, I recall that. Yeah. I remember that work.
And Ace was the captain, and there was sort of, representations of the different soccer legends. And then there was the white kid that comes in, and that's Gary,
Yeah.
But it was such a fantastically observed set of character studies. So, that's what draws me personally. I mean, I know my wife continually replays the ad, and I don't know if you'd know it, but I think it's a My Way ad, in which the two old women are driving along, and this woman is just driving across Ireland through traffic lights, and the woman next to her says, do you know that you've just driven through the traffic light or whatever? And the woman turns to her and she says, am I driving, Mavis? And
I remember that.
I'm telling it extraordinarily badly.
Yeah, I remember that. Am I driving? I remember that.
Am I driving, Mavis? So I mean, the genius there is in the writing, I suppose.
Yes.
But again, it's a great representation of two characters, and I'm sort of, I've reached the stage where sort of my short-term memory is a little patchy, and so I can relate to those circumstances. So what am I saying to you? Tell stories and observe those characters with love.
Capture the human insight.
With love. I mean, if I think back on all those ads, think of all those chicken licking ads.
Yes.
Those characters are well-loved characters. I mean, and he loves the character on this side of the counter as well as the character on that side of the counter. It's like,
Yeah. Angus, we usually have a question that our previous guest leaves for our next guest. And one of our guests was Seth Godin, a marketing visionary and multi-best-selling author and entrepreneur. And really the question that he left for you was, what systems in the world do you see that most people don't? And he describes system as, the solar system is a system, that keeps the Earth rotating around the sun. The military industrial system is a system, the educational, educational industrial system itself is a system that keeps Ivy League colleges raising their prices and everybody else sort of, flocking to them. So what systems in the world do you see that most people don't? And how are you changing them when you see these systems? Or what are your thoughts on changing them?
Well, I suppose, let me speak specifically about television.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a system, but there is a copycat kind of syndrome that I think plagues television, and certainly plagues contemporary television in South Africa. And I think it goes back to leadership. I mean, I think, sort of, we have young, inexperienced, and often very smart commissioning editors in broadcast spaces nowadays. And they are very nervous of, they feel a big need to perform. And there is a fear of failure, huge fear of failure. And experimentation and failure kind of go together, inevitably.
Yeah.
But experimentation and success also go together.
Yes.
If you aren't prepared to fail, the likelihood of anything visionary happening is unlikely. And so I think the system of repetition and the system of, for example, going to the audience and saying, what did you think of this and what do you think of that? Test screening and all that sort of thing, I'm suspicious of.
Yeah.
I'm interested in original thought.
And usually that innovation isn't met well in the beginning, but actually it's what changes the system.
Yeah. So, I'm interested in original thought, and I think ultimately that takes courage, and it takes the willingness to fail and to learn from failing, which that's not a new thought. So, I think lots of people see the system that I'm describing. I'm not unique, and I'm not unique in that. But I do feel like the audience wearies of the safe space.
Yeah.
And the truth is, the new, when repeated many times, becomes middle of the road.
Yeah. Angus, thank you so much. The last question that we usually ask really is similar to the question that was left for you. So, what's the one question that you'd ask our next guest about their work, their creative process, thoughts on the industry, or about life for that matter? What's the one question that you would leave for them?
I suppose, a thing that I think quite a lot about is political correctness.
Yeah.
And in many ways, in the contemporary world, I feel like I almost represent a sort of non-political correctness, in that I trespass into spaces that I think in the contemporary world, people believe you shouldn't trespass into.
Yeah.
And so I suppose my question would be, I'm interested, in the other person's view of what right have we to tell stories that are not our own. Am I able to tell a story of a woman? Am I able to tell a story of a trans person? Am I able to tell the story of a black person? I'm interested in that question, and let that be it.
Awesome. Angus, thank you so much for making the time. It was an absolute honor having you on the show.
Mongezi, thanks so much. You asked me lots of difficult questions. And I think I sort of only half answered them. But anyway.
No, they're all
thank
great
you.
answers.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Lead Creative. Did you get one insight that's worth sharing from this episode? Please share it with your network or your friends. Pop me some of your ideas and innovative finds on Twitter on @Mongezi. This podcast is available on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find me on mongezi.com.